Hello dear friends, and welcome to Highlights of the Book, Action and Reaction. Today we are reviewing Chapter 4. It is entitled Some Newly-Discarnates. Leo, it is a fascinating chapter. I know that we were studying it and reading it together. And there are a number of highlights we wanted to bring. First of which, the opening, when Andre Luiz brings us how it all sort of unfolds. We learned at the end of Chapter 3 they are coming to a particular, what he describes like an atrium or like a meeting place, where the discarnates are being brought in like this convoy to be met by spirits who are their family members, friends, dear loved ones who are welcoming them. Leo, one of the most interesting things when we were studying, we found that these souls were really newly discarnates. They weren't in the lower zone someplace. They weren't suffering in some abyss of some external hell, although they were mentally unstable, that they tell us in this particular chapter. With other significant things as well we learned, right?
We can describe this as you were mentioning, you know, imagine ourselves in an atrium in an airport, if we can say that way, or a railway station where you come and meeting other individuals, loved ones. And it was the same case here that Andre Luiz is bringing to us, that some of the individuals are arriving and they are newly discarnated. It's not like in case of Andre Luiz, who was rescued from the lower regions. These are actually individuals who, again, they recently lost their physical body. And they are being brought to loved ones, friends in this location, and they were in a very difficult state of mind. They're not so bad, though, as we may imagine. They have some ideas, some recollection what happening to them, but they are in need of help, certainly.
Right, and that's exactly what the assistant Silas, what he says. He says that, we wanted to quote, that they were, although mentally unstable, they also, on the planet Earth, they had not completely given up hope, nor had they completely yielded to dark forces, or forces of darkness, as Silas actually says it. So we can see that these souls, they weren't so horrible. So Silas tells us that they warranted being helped. So that's kind of how the beginning chapter sort of unfolds for us, right, Leo?
That is correct.
It's interesting because he refers to them having this peaceable madness, meaning that they were able to control them. But there were a couple of interesting cases that Andre Luiz, along with Hilario, had taken note of. I mean, there were a number, they said about 19 total that were there, including about 10 helpers, right?
That is correct.
That were there. And the one particular case that stood out to us in the beginning really was a case of a young woman who, when she saw Silas, was interesting was that she looked at him as if he were a priest, and immediately, true to, you know, Catholics, and they actually tell us that she's a Roman Catholic, she sees him, begins doing her, you know, confession. She says, Father, Father, forgive me, I have sinned against my mother. So the case unfolds that she actually was a very ungrateful daughter. Her mother, as the story unfolds, was a very famous actress whom they don't name. Was a very famous actress who'd given up the limelight all for her daughter, raised her daughter along with the help of her partner, who actually wasn't that good of a father, who didn't really help her too much. And basically she grew up in poverty. And later on in life, she was a very ungrateful daughter because she basically turned her back on her mother. When she got married and inherited her dowry from her father, she abandoned the mother. She kicked the mother out of the house because she was ashamed of coming from such, you know, impoverished or, you know, very humble beginnings, as we say. So now in her old age, right before she discarnated, she had this extreme amount of guilt within her. And that's where Andre Luiz finds her, and he's so touched by this. Because the most fascinating of this case is the woman. Remember now, when the people arrived in the caravan convoy, there were people waiting for them. There were family members waiting for them. And who was there giving her hand and helping this troubled woman but her mother? The very woman who she had abandoned was the very person who was there to welcome her with open arms as she discarnated and waiting for her on the other side in Mansell Paz.
And the interesting thing that she doesn't remember her mother.
She doesn't recognize her. She doesn't even see her, actually. Right. She takes note that someone is there, but not really. So we see that that's interesting too, Leo, that when we newly discarnate, doesn't mean that we're going to automatically see our loved ones. We may have some notion of feeling them, but not necessarily, right?
Depending on how we are, though, mentally speaking.
Depending upon our level, which is interesting. But there's also other cases that we could discuss, and there's one other case in particular we could also discuss if you wanted to talk about. It was the case of the woman who was screaming and yelling.
That is correct,
and
yes. Very interesting.
Very interesting.
And I would like to quote from the book the way she comes and she stops, the whole conversation.
Right.
In this rescue moment, if we can say that way.
She disrupts the whole situation.
She disrupts the whole situation. She says, "Who's going to deliver me from Satan? Who's going to deliver me from the power of darkness? Holy angels, please help me. Help me against the dreadful Belphegor." And it's interesting here that she's, again, in the same position, perhaps as a Catholic individual who put her attention on the Catholic beliefs. She's, again, bringing out all these things about the Satan, who's going to read the images that she has created in her mind, and that's what they explain. The explanation is that she's an individual who cultivate the images, the ideas that she had received from the churches and from perhaps something that she had read, she had studied, and she kept cultivating that idea. And what happened was it intensified as she was thinking, as she was analyzing those ideas and those pictures, and she died with that thought as well. Now that she's now recently discarnated and she lost the body. And they go into the discussion of explaining how that happens. And it's amazing that because the mentor tells us that we hardly know how the power of our mind works. Yeah. And because we take the time to look at pictures, to look at, to analyze things that are not good for us, and we, again, maximize with our energies, and we also attract others who are thinking alike, and we bring a huge problem to our lives. Yeah. And as we were saying, it's like a boomerang, right?
It really is.
We throw that thought, it picks up more energy and comes back to us because it eventually will come back to us.
Which is a scary thought, but that's what the assistant Silas, what he mentions. He talks about on page 51 of chapter 4. If you guys want to go ahead and read it yourselves, we always encourage you to read the book. He says the agglutinative power contained in pure and simple thought. And he gives us these images that we have such a responsibility for our inner life because it has so much power. And Leo, yes, we discussed about the idea of our thought is sort of like a boomerang. And as we throw it out, yes, it comes back to us. But guess what? That boomerang also has sort of magnetic power. It's picking up a bunch of friends and it's coming right back to us.
Right back to us.
Leo, it really is kind of scary when we think about it, because if we stop to think just one day or a week's worth of our thoughts, and we know that our thoughts have power and they manifest in our lives and they attract other energies, we know that creates a huge responsibility for us.
Anything that we think, if we can take this to our day-to-day lives, anything that we can think or we feel, perhaps maybe something that, yes, we bring from the past, but what are we doing with these thoughts now? What are we doing with these feelings now? So perhaps the images, what we have learned from previous reincarnations, as they mentioned in the book, what are we doing with this now? Are we trying to liberate ourselves or intensifying as we go on with our lives?
And these thoughts are so significant. The power of thought is so significant, right? Because the particular case you discussed, they talk about how the woman had this hellish idea of this demonic figure. And when they wound up, because the woman was so out of control, they actually magnetized her, put her to sleep. And when Andre Luiz went to sort of do like a spiritual MRI or CT scan of her brain, basically they saw this image of half man, half goat, hoofed man. You know, and basically he was like, oh my gosh. And Silas is like, look, that's not really, you know, there's no real spirit there. It's just, it's in her mind. Why? because they mention it at that particular time, the Catholic Church, or at a time, the Catholic Church had released a lot of literature about these satanic images that impregnated in thousands of people's minds and had made it very difficult for them to assist during the discarnation process, because people with a guilty conscience had this idea of hell and this idea of demonic creatures. So they were really this idea of guilt. It is, and it's this idea of guilt, right?
Yes.
Our emotions, working on our emotions, because both cases are significant for the idea of guilt. Both felt guilty for things they have done wrong in their lives. The first case, the girl who was adamant that she was a bad daughter. She abandoned her mother in her time of need. So she had this guilt complex that Selah says she was stagnated in remorse. And what is to be stagnant is to be stuck. That's why she was like rolling over and over again in this clip of remorse.
And the second, the same way, based on her own thoughts and whatever she gave, she gave emphasis in her life.
It gave her vitality.
She's now feeling in this feeling of guilt, trying to rescue herself from something that she really put herself into. Again, going back to the beginning of the book, the responsibility. Where is the responsibility? Is somebody else actually presented to us? Yeah, maybe. I mean, somebody can come and give me a book. I may look at it. Now I have to discern. What am I going to do to these images? Is this something good for me or good for the environment? So these are the responsibilities that we have to take in our day-to-day lives. And
Leo, one of the things that reminds me as we wrap this up is that we read this and we want so much to share with others, to say, hey, pay attention to your thoughts. And for us as well, you know, as in the beginning of the other chapters, when the director Druso says, you know, I'm not separated from you with a pile of virtues. I am the same as you, my brother, my sister. I'm working on myself. And so we stand here not as someone who's completed that, but we say, hey, we're working on it. But we wanted to share this. Let us be more vigilant of our thoughts and our emotions. Because sometimes we may only like to do one, or we're more apt to do either or of those things. But be aware of your thoughts and your emotions. Dear friends, we recommend you to go and read this whole book and this chapter and be enlightened. Until next time.
Thank you.